Sleep is the most ordinary miracle of life. It waits for everyone, every night, offering repair, renewal, and relief. It levels the powerful and the powerless, the believer and the skeptic. In its silence, the mind drifts through a world without clocks, where time softens and the body restores what the waking hours have taken. To most of humanity, sleep is so common it goes unnoticed, until it disappears. In the years after the Second World War, northern Italy carried the quiet hum of recovery. Families rebuilt, factories reopened, and the country seemed to breathe again. In the small town of Treviso, one such family lived in the comfortable anonymity of the post-war years. They worked, prayed, and shared evening meals in the rhythm of ordinary life. No one imagined that within this household a tragedy would unfold that would rewrite what science understood about the human brain. The first sign was so small that no one paid attention. A man in his early 50s, healthy, strong, accustomed to hard work, began to complain that he could not fall asleep. At first his wife thought it was nerves. The 1950s were anxious years, and sleeplessness was hardly unusual. But the nights grew longer. He tossed and turned, counted the hours until dawn, and then went about his day with a strange, fixed calm. Weeks passed, and still he did not sleep. Doctors prescribed herbal tonics and mild sedatives. When those failed, they offered stronger pills. The medicine dulled his thoughts but never brought true rest. Instead of dreams, he found hallucinations. Faces floated before his eyes. His body trembled. His once steady hands could no longer hold a cup of coffee without spilling it. In the clinic notes, a young physician wrote a single sentence. Patient shows progressive insomnia of unknown origin. The year was 1959, and medicine had no vocabulary for what was happening inside his brain. There were no scans, no genetic tests, no framework to explain a disease that began with sleepless nights and ended in death. The family watched as the man's body slowly betrayed him. He lost weight. His pupils stayed wide even in the dark. By the 6th month, he could not walk without help. By the 9th, his mind slipped between lucidity and dreamlike confusion. He murmured that he was awake inside a nightmare. Then one winter morning, his heart stopped. Doctors performed an autopsy but found nothing unusual. The brain appeared intact. There was no tumor, no infection, no clue. The cause of death was written as heart failure secondary to exhaustion. The body was buried, and the mystery went with it. Years later, another member of the same family began to complain of sleeplessness. The pattern repeated: restlessness, hallucinations, loss of coordination, rapid decline. The family whispered that it was a curse, something passed down in blood. The physicians, skeptical, attributed it to anxiety or grief. Yet, as the years rolled forward, generation after generation fell to the same fate. No one outside Treviso noticed. Italy was modernizing. The world was obsessed with technology and the race to space. A few neurologists collected case reports of familial insomnia, but the data were scattered and inconclusive. In medical libraries, the phenomenon was a footnote. It would take decades before science caught up with this family's tragedy, but before that discovery came, there were nights, thousands of nights, when sons, daughters, uncles, and cousins lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aware that they were watching their own ending unfold in slow motion. To lose sleep for a night is unpleasant. To lose it forever is unthinkable. Without sleep, the immune system collapses, memories dissolve, and emotions fracture. Hallucinations bloom. The body begins to devour its own energy reserves. Death from sleeplessness is not peaceful. It is an unraveling of every rhythm that keeps a human alive. For this Italian family, each new case began the same way: a restless night, a racing heart, a small fear that grew into certainty. Once the symptoms started, no one survived more than a year. The illness respected no prayers, no medicine, no willpower. It arrived like a shadow and consumed its host. By the late 1970s, the pattern caught the attention of a neurologist from Bologna named Dr. Ignazio Reuter. He had heard rumors of a hereditary disorder that robbed victims of sleep until they died. Skeptical but curious, he traveled north to meet the family. What he found would mark the beginning of one of the most haunting medical investigations of the 20th century. Reuter was methodical, precise, and empathetic. He sat at their kitchen tables, listened to their stories, and studied their photographs. Several branches of the same bloodline had already lost members in identical fashion. The families showed him death certificates, all citing vague causes: cardiac failure, nervous exhaustion, psychosomatic collapse. None mentioned the one symptom that united them all: the inability to sleep. He began keeping detailed notes. The cases occurred roughly once every decade, affecting both men and women in middle age. The onset was sudden. Within months, the victims experienced tremors, sweating, and vivid hallucinations while fully awake. Toward the end, they became unrecognizable, eyes wide, faces gaunt, bodies rigid with fatigue. Then came coma and death. Reuter sent letters to hospitals across Italy asking if similar cases existed elsewhere. Replies trickled in from Venice, Florence, even as far as Paris, isolated reports of families cursed by sleeplessness. Each letter added to a growing suspicion that this was not a coincidence but a genetic disease yet to be named. In 1984, Reuter collaborated with another neurologist, Dr. Elio Lugaresi, a pioneering sleep researcher at the University of Bologna. Lugaresi's laboratory was one of the few in Europe equipped to measure brainwave activity during sleep. Together, they persuaded surviving relatives to undergo study. Volunteers were brought to Bologna and wired to EEG machines. Their brainwaves revealed something extraordinary. Even when they appeared to drift off, their thalamus, the deep structure that regulates sleep, never shut down. Their brains were trapped between wakefulness and dream. The data were undeniable. The disease was attacking the part of the brain responsible for transitioning into sleep. The doctors called it a thalamic degeneration of unknown origin. To the world outside the lab, it would soon have a more evocative name: fatal familial insomnia. It was during these years that the story began to travel beyond Italy. Scientific journals published short reports. Newspapers picked up the phrase, "the family who can't sleep." Television producers requested interviews, though most relatives refused to appear on camera. They valued privacy, dignity, and a quiet life, things the illness had already stolen from them. Among researchers, the disease provoked both fascination and dread. It bore resemblance to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a rare and terrifying neurological disorder that caused rapid dementia and death. But the patients with fatal insomnia remained conscious until the end, trapped inside failing bodies. Scientists suspected an infectious protein, a prion, might be to blame. As studies expanded, Reuter and Lugaresi realized the implications. If the disease was hereditary, then living family members could carry the mutation without knowing it. It meant that somewhere in the world, people might be walking around with a silent countdown in their genes, destined one day to close their eyes and never find rest again. The revelation sent ripples through the medical community. For the families, it was a storm. Some wanted to know if they carried the gene, others refused, preferring the comfort of uncertainty. Testing in the 1980s was primitive, requiring painful spinal procedures and post-mortem confirmation. The choice was between fear and ignorance. While the doctors debated mechanisms, the patients continued to die. Each case became a study in human endurance. One middle-aged woman kept a diary through her final months. The handwriting grew smaller and more erratic as the nights stretched on. Her last entry read simply, "Still awake." It was around this time that the outside world finally began to take notice. A small documentary crew visited Bologna to film Lugaresi's research. Viewers were astonished by footage of patients whose eyes remained open even as their bodies weakened. The narrator's voice asked, "What if sleep itself could turn against us?" Amid this wave of curiosity and compassion, the story reached a young generation of historians and storytellers who believed that hidden lives reveal the deepest truths about humanity. Among them were the creators of Shadow Chapters, a series dedicated to forgotten histories and extraordinary fates. They saw in this Italian family not merely a medical curiosity, but a profound lesson in endurance, faith, and the limits of the human body. They would tell it not as a spectacle, but as a testament. How one family's suffering unlocked a mystery that would teach the world why we sleep and what happens when we cannot. The laboratories at the University of Bologna were small, bright rooms lined with oscillating machines that hummed through the night. Here, for the first time, the sleepless family's tragedy was being translated into data. Patients arrived weary and frightened, their faces drawn with months of exhaustion. Electrodes were fastened to their scalps, chest, and wrists. When the lights were dimmed, their brains continued to blaze with activity. The monitors traced lines of unbroken wakefulness, flat waves where there should have been the deep valleys of dreams. For Dr. Lugaresi and his colleagues, the discovery was both thrilling and horrifying. They had confirmed that the illness did not simply cause sleeplessness. It destroyed the mechanism of sleep itself. The thalamus, that quiet gatekeeper between consciousness and rest, was withering away. Yet the rest of the brain remained aware, recording every moment of its own decline. The findings were sent to neurologists across Europe. Some doubted them. Others saw the beginning of an entirely new category of disease. When similar patterns appeared in autopsies from France and Austria, skepticism faded. A few scientists whispered comparisons to the mysterious prion disorders that had begun appearing in animals and humans, conditions where a single misfolded protein could turn the brain into a maze of holes. In 1986, an autopsy performed on one of the victims confirmed those fears. Under the microscope, the tissue looked like a honeycomb. Tiny vacuoles riddled the thalamus. The same microscopic scars were seen in the medulla and cerebral cortex. A pathologist peering down the lens murmured that it looked as if sleep itself had been eaten away. From this moment, the investigation widened. Samples were sent to laboratories in London and the United States. Everywhere the same abnormal protein appeared. Scientists now used a new word with a chill in its syllables: prion, a protein that could copy its warped shape onto healthy molecules, turning them deadly. In these Italian brains, prions had found a target no one had imagined: the circuit that governed the most universal human need. As reports accumulated, the phrase fatal familial insomnia entered medical literature. For the Bologna team, the naming was an act of both clarity and grief. Naming a thing gives it form, but it also confirms its reality. There was no longer doubt. This was an inherited sentence. For the family, the word familial struck hardest. It meant that the cause was not random. It was written into their DNA. Every generation carried the possibility of awakening one day to the knowledge that sleep would never come again. During these years, the afflicted were still being treated as best medicine allowed. Doctors prescribed barbiturates, tranquilizers, even experimental anesthetics. None worked. The drugs dimmed consciousness but did not create true rest. Some patients slipped into delirium. Others became trapped in half-dreams, where they could no longer tell day from night. In the wards of Bologna, nurses spoke softly. Lights were lowered, and still the patients stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, whispering fragments of dreams they could not enter. Dr. Reuter spent nights beside their beds, taking notes. He observed that the illness followed an almost ritual sequence. In the first stage, anxiety and insomnia. In the second, hallucinations and sweating. In the third, complete loss of coordination. In the fourth, mute wakefulness and death. He wrote in his notebook, 4 acts of a single tragedy. By the late 1980s, the case had drawn the attention of molecular biologists. Among them was Dr. Stanley Prusiner at the University of California. whose research into prions would later earn the Nobel Prize. His laboratory compared samples from the Italian family with those from Creutzfeldt-Jakob patients. The differences were subtle but decisive. In the sleepless family, the prions attacked the thalamus first, and almost exclusively. It was a unique fingerprint, a new variant of a nightmare. The Italian government quietly funded further study. Grants arrived from the European Union. The family, once isolated, now found strangers arriving at their door. Reporters, filmmakers, young scientists. Some relatives agreed to interviews, speaking with a dignity that surprised the journalists who expected horror. They described their lost parents not as victims, but as pioneers who had given science a map into the darkest region of the brain. Among the surviving members, there was debate about testing. Genetic sequencing was still primitive, but researchers had identified a suspicious region on chromosome 20. To know whether one carried the mutation was to know one's future. Some said yes immediately. They wanted to face fate with open eyes. Others refused, choosing to live without that shadow. Families divided quietly over the decision. In one of the most poignant accounts from that period, a daughter described watching her mother fade. She was awake even when her body began to shut down, she said. Her eyes were open, but she was already far away. The doctors said she was dreaming while awake. I think she was saying goodbye to us. The scientists, too, struggled with the emotional weight. They were accustomed to studying cells, not destinies. At conferences, they spoke in cautious language: mutation, transmission, pathology. But beneath the precision was an unease rarely voiced aloud. What does it mean to discover an illness that strikes without mercy, and that science cannot yet stop? In 1991, molecular analysis finally confirmed the culprit. A single change in the PRNP gene, substituting one amino acid for another, an almost invisible typo in the code of life. That small error folded the prion protein the wrong way, setting off a chain reaction that ate through the thalamus. It was the same mechanism as Creutzfeldt-Jakob, but slower and crueler, leaving the mind intact long enough to witness its own collapse. With this revelation came a strange mixture of triumph and despair. The mystery had been solved, yet no treatment existed. Knowing the cause did not stop the disease. Families could now test their children, but what parent would wish such knowledge on them? In Bologna, Dr. Lugaresi stood before his students and said, "This family has taught us more about sleep than any experiment could. They have shown us what happens when the night never comes." His lecture ended in silence. Outside the university, autumn leaves drifted across the cobblestones. Life continued. Markets opened, trains arrived, children laughed on their way to school. But inside the hospital wards, another patient struggled through another endless night. The monitors traced steady wakefulness. The nurses checked their watches. Somewhere, another clock in the same bloodline began to tick. The story might have remained within scientific circles if not for a handful of journalists who recognized its eerie poetry. They wrote articles titled "The Disease That Ends in Wakefulness" and "The Family That Forgot How to Sleep." Readers were captivated and horrified. Letters poured in from around the world, people convinced they suffered the same curse, others simply expressing sympathy. Through it all, the surviving relatives maintained a quiet grace. They allowed their names to be used in medical journals, but declined television fame. They said they wanted their family's suffering to mean something, that if their story helped even one patient elsewhere, it would be enough. Their wish was granted in ways they could not have foreseen. Research into fatal familial insomnia opened new understanding of prion diseases and of sleep itself. The tragedy of Treviso became a cornerstone for neuroscientists studying why the brain must rest, how memory consolidates, and how consciousness resets. By the mid-1990s, laboratories across Europe, America, and Japan had identified other, smaller lineages carrying the same mutation. None were as well documented as the original Italian family, but each confirmed the pattern. The illness was rare, fewer than one case per 10 million people, but its existence changed the map of neurology. At the same time, ethicists began debating a new question. Should people be told if they carry a gene for which no cure exists? Could knowledge itself become a form of suffering? For fatal familial insomnia, the question was not theoretical. In quiet consultation rooms, doctors faced patients who asked, "Would you want to know?" Some answered yes. Others walked away in silence. The world had entered an age when destiny could be read in molecules. And yet, for all its scientific precision, the story of the sleepless family remained profoundly human. A reminder that behind every breakthrough lies a heartbeat, a dinner table, a set of photographs that someone keeps in a drawer. The more researchers learned, the more awe they felt at the complexity of ordinary sleep. It was not merely rest. It was the nightly orchestration of hormones, memories, and dreams. A symphony so intricate that when one instrument faltered, the entire composition fell apart. And so the family in northern Italy, whose name most of the world would never know, became silent teachers. Through their suffering, they revealed what it truly means to be human, a creature that must surrender to darkness each night to remain whole. By the late 1990s, the Italian family's story had spread beyond medical journals into conferences and university classrooms. What had once been an obscure neurological mystery was now recognized as one of the most haunting hereditary diseases ever recorded. Doctors no longer doubted its existence. The challenge was understanding its boundaries, who carried the mutation, when it would strike, and whether anything could be done to prevent it. The turning point came with the rapid development of genetic sequencing technology. For the first time, researchers could search for the precise mutation within a living person's DNA. The Italian kindred agreed to provide samples. Blood was drawn from every willing relative. And within months, scientists had mapped the variant responsible, a single-letter substitution in the PRNP gene, changing the amino acid asparagine to aspartic acid at position 178. The discovery was small in appearance but enormous in consequence. It confirmed that the disease followed an autosomal dominant pattern, meaning that anyone who inherited the mutation from one parent had a 50% chance of developing fatal familial insomnia. For the family, this knowledge was a double-edged gift. It gave shape to the invisible enemy that had haunted them for generations, but it also placed an unbearable question in their hands. Would they choose to know? Genetic counselors explained that a simple test could now reveal their future. There was no treatment, no way to delay or prevent the disease. A positive result would be a lifelong shadow, a certainty of decline once middle age approached. Some family members refused testing entirely, believing that ignorance offered the only peace still available. Others felt compelled to learn the truth, hoping that knowledge might at least grant time to prepare. A physician who worked with the group later recalled how quiet the counseling sessions were. "No one spoke for a long time," he said. They looked at the test papers as if they were sacred and dangerous at once. Those who tested positive faced a unique psychological burden. They were healthy, often in their 20s or 30s, yet knew that somewhere ahead lay a night from which they would not wake. Medical journals began describing this experience as anticipatory grief, mourning one's own future. A few volunteered for experimental monitoring, allowing scientists to record brain activity years before symptoms appeared. These studies, conducted in Bologna, Vienna, and the United States, revealed subtle changes in the thalamus long before insomnia began. The data helped confirm the pathway of the disease and gave researchers a window into the earliest stages of neural degeneration. While science advanced, the family lived between hope and resignation. Couples hesitated to have children, fearful of passing on the mutation. Some turned to adoption. Others accepted the risk, trusting that new therapies might arrive in time. In medical ethics seminars, their story became a case study. Should doctors offer predictive testing for conditions that remain incurable? There was no consensus. Each generation seemed to make its own peace with the uncertainty. Outside Italy, similar cases began to surface. A German lineage with the same mutation was identified in 1993, followed by smaller clusters in Austria, the United States, and Australia. All traced their ancestry to distant European roots. In each, the symptoms followed the same cruel pattern: progressive insomnia, panic attacks, hallucinations, dementia, and finally death. The consistency of the course confirmed that fatal familial insomnia was not a local phenomenon, but a global one, albeit extremely rare. Only about 40 families worldwide. Researchers at the National Institutes of Health in Maryland began collaborating with the Bologna team, comparing clinical notes and brain samples. They found that the disease's onset typically occurred between ages 30 and 60. Life expectancy after diagnosis averaged 12 to 18 months. These figures appeared in scientific literature, stripped of emotion, yet behind each number was a person, a teacher, a farmer, a mother, all united by the same invisible flaw in their DNA. The study of FFI also deepened understanding of prion biology itself. By the end of the decade, researchers had demonstrated how misfolded prion proteins could propagate through the brain without any involvement of bacteria or viruses, defying the classic definitions of infection. Stanley Prusiner's pioneering work, which linked prions to several human diseases, was honored with the 1997 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. In his acceptance lecture, he mentioned the Italian family, acknowledging their courage in allowing science to learn from their tragedy. For neurologists, the discovery was transformative. It revealed that the brain's structure was far more fragile than previously imagined, and that sleep, once thought to be a passive process, was a vital function dependent on precise molecular harmony. As one researcher wrote, "Fatal familial insomnia is the proof that without sleep, humanity ceases to exist not metaphorically, but biologically." At the dawn of the 21st century, new tools gave scientists the ability to peer deeper into the living brain. Magnetic resonance imaging and positron emission tomography allowed researchers to watch metabolism flicker and fade in the thalamus years before outward symptoms appeared. For the first time, doctors could visualize the slow, inevitable erosion of the sleep centers that defined fatal familial insomnia. The Bologna team worked closely with neurologists in the United States. Among them was Dr. Pierluigi Gambetti, an Italian-born pathologist who had moved to Case Western Reserve University. His laboratory became a global reference point for prion research. There, preserved tissue from deceased patients was stored in stainless steel freezers, each labeled with a code rather than a name. Gambetti described his work as a dialogue with the dead, the attempt to let their brains speak on behalf of the living. Despite the advances, no treatment emerged. Prions were immune to antibiotics and resistant to standard sterilization. They could survive formaldehyde, radiation, even incineration. The only protection was understanding, and understanding came at the cost of more lives. In Italy, descendants of the original family tried to continue their routines. Some became advocates for medical research, appearing at conferences to remind scientists that behind the microscopes stood ordinary people trying to raise children and live quietly. Others withdrew completely, unwilling to relive the pain in public. Over time, most chose anonymity. Their names were replaced in medical literature by initials, a small act of dignity preserved through privacy. A few physicians who followed the family across decades began to document the psychological patterns of those at risk. They observed an undercurrent of chronic vigilance. Even the healthy members, once they reached middle age, monitored every restless night with suspicion. One sleepless week could send them back to the hospital for tests, desperate for reassurance. This constant self-observation became known as the insomnia of fear. Genetic counseling programs expanded in Europe and North America, offering confidential testing to those who might carry the mutation. The sessions were long and emotionally charged. Doctors emphasized that a negative result could bring relief, but a positive one came with no medical benefit, only knowledge. Many chose to be tested and then sealed their results in envelopes they never opened. The envelope became a symbol of control, a choice between certainty and ignorance that could be exercised at any time. In the laboratories, scientists turned their attention from detection to prevention. Animal studies suggested that prion diseases might be slowed by compounds that stabilized normal protein shapes. Experimental molecules, quinacrine, doxycycline, pentosan polysulfate, were tried with mixed and largely disappointing results. The prions proved tenacious. Still, the effort was not wasted. Each trial expanded understanding of how prions propagate, information that would later help in developing diagnostics for other neurodegenerative conditions such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Public interest in fatal familial insomnia peaked briefly in 2002 after the publication of The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a detailed nonfiction account by journalist D.T. Max. The book traced the saga from the earliest cases to the modern laboratories of Bologna and Cleveland. It described the scientists, the ethics, and the quiet courage of those who faced their own biological fate. Reviewers called it both terrifying and deeply humane. The story reached audiences who had never before considered sleep as anything more than rest. Around the same time, a handful of documentaries aired on European and American television. They showed laboratory footage and interviews with researchers, but maintained the family's anonymity. Viewers were struck by the idea that a single genetic letter could determine whether a person ever dreams again. In online forums, people speculated about cures and shared their own experiences with insomnia, though ordinary sleeplessness bore no relation to the fatal form. Still, the disease captured imagination precisely because it transformed something universal into something deadly. In Bologna, the original team aged alongside their research. Dr. Lugaresi retired, his protégés continuing the work. They established a national registry for prion diseases and created one of the first public health protocols for handling infected tissue. Their methods would later prove crucial during outbreaks of variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease linked to contaminated beef in the United Kingdom. The lessons learned from the sleepless family indirectly protected thousands. As the 2000s progressed, researchers began collaborating with genetic engineers to study the PRNP mutation in transgenic mice. These models developed symptoms mirroring the human condition: weight loss, hyperactivity, disrupted sleep cycles, and eventual thalamic degeneration. The experiments confirmed that the disease mechanism was intrinsic to the prion's shape. No virus or external factor was needed. This finding closed one of the last debates about the nature of prion disorders and cemented their place in medical textbooks. For the broader scientific community, fatal familial insomnia became a moral anchor, a reminder that every gene sequence represents not just data, but destiny. Conferences that once focused on technical detail began including ethics panels. Physicians asked how to counsel families when the only advice was patience and empathy. Bioethicists wrote essays titled "The Knowledge That Cannot Heal" and "The Burden of the Predisposed." Each returned to the same question: is it kinder to know or not to know? Within the family, life continued in quiet defiance. Some members married, raised children, and pursued careers far from medicine. They agreed that the disease would not define them, even though it followed them like an invisible twin. When a relative developed symptoms, others gathered at the hospital, providing care until the end. Those final vigils became both medical observation and ritual farewell. Doctors recorded every change in brain activity. Family members recorded the memory of presence, the holding of hands, the long silence that preceded death. One of the physicians who attended several deaths later said, "It is unlike any other illness. The patients are lucid until near the end. They speak, they recognize you, they know what is happening. It is the most courageous kind of dying I have ever seen." By the middle of the decade, the number of documented FFI cases worldwide remained below 100. Yet their impact on neuroscience was immense. Through them, researchers had discovered how fragile the architecture of sleep truly was, and how a single molecular flaw could dismantle it. The disease had begun as a family's private tragedy, and ended as a cornerstone of modern brain science. By the end of the first decade of the new century, the Italian family's name had largely disappeared from the news, but their legacy lived on in laboratories around the world. Every medical student learning about prion disorders encountered the same case study: a hereditary thalamic degeneration that abolishes sleep. The anonymity that the descendants had asked for was respected. In papers and lectures, they were referred to simply as the index family. While the public's attention drifted to other medical mysteries, researchers quietly continued to map the prion's journey through the brain. Advances in imaging made it possible to watch the disease unfold in real time. Functional MRI scans of early-stage patients showed that as the thalamus weakened, neighboring regions of the brain tried to compensate. They flickered with frantic activity, attempting to maintain normal cycles of wakefulness and dreaming. The effort was futile, but revealed an astonishing resilience. Even when dying, the brain fought to sleep. In the United States, the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center, established in 1997, began collecting global data. Among hundreds of samples from variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob and Gerstmann-Straussler-Scheinker syndromes, a handful bore the signature mutation of fatal familial insomnia. The records confirmed its rarity, but also its consistency. Regardless of nationality or environment, the course was the same: sleeplessness leading to disintegration of mind and body within a year and a half. This precision allowed neurologists to define the 4 clinical stages more clearly. In the first, patients developed anxiety, sympathetic overdrive, and vivid dreams intruding into wakefulness. In the second, blood pressure and pulse remained elevated day and night. The pupils failed to contract, and hallucinations appeared. The third brought weight loss, balance problems, and autonomic failure. The fourth, terminal stage, ended in muteness and coma. These descriptions were now standard in medical manuals, replacing the anecdotal sketches that had filled early papers. At Bologna, a new generation of scientists took up the work. They explored how prions corrupted proteins at the molecular level, how the misfolded shapes induced neighboring molecules to twist into the same lethal pattern. Experiments in cell cultures demonstrated that the process resembled crystallization more than infection. A single distorted seed could transform an entire population of proteins within days. From these insights emerged a broader theory of neurodegeneration. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Huntington's diseases, long considered distinct, might all share prion-like mechanisms, self-propagating protein misfolding that spreads through neural tissue. The sleepless family had unwittingly provided the key to uniting disorders that afflict millions. In conferences, researchers occasionally paused to acknowledge this human origin. Slides of molecular models would fade, replaced by a photograph of a quiet Italian village. The speaker would remind the audience that the science existed because ordinary people had agreed to let their tragedy be studied. Every data set, one lecturer said, was once a person who could not sleep. Meanwhile, sleep research itself underwent a renaissance. The idea that sleep is passive rest gave way to the recognition that it is an active metabolic necessity. During deep sleep, the brain flushes waste through the glymphatic system, resets hormonal cycles, and consolidates memory. Without it, toxins accumulate, neurons misfire, and personality dissolves. The stark example of fatal familial insomnia illustrated these principles with brutal clarity. Journalists who revisited the subject in the 2010 S found that most of the surviving descendants preferred silence. A few granted interviews on condition of anonymity, emphasizing that they wanted their children to grow up without stigma. They supported ongoing research but asked to be left in peace. "We have given enough," one relative said. Let the science speak now. For scientists, that wish carried weight. Publications from this period focus almost entirely on mechanisms and potential therapies, rarely mentioning personal stories. Yet behind every diagram lay the same enduring lesson, that the absence of sleep is incompatible with life, and that the need for rest is written as deeply into our biology as the beat of the heart. By the middle of the 2010s, nearly every question that could be answered about fatal familial insomnia had been explored. The world's prion disease registries listed fewer than 100 confirmed cases in total since the disorder was first recognized. Its rarity made large clinical trials impossible, but each new patient contributed invaluable data. Researchers at the University of Bologna, Case Western Reserve University, and the U.S. National Institutes of Health continued to share samples and case histories. They refined diagnostic tools, MRI patterns showing early thalamic shrinkage, cerebrospinal fluid tests for abnormal prion protein fragments, and genetic sequencing that could now identify the D178N mutation within hours instead of weeks. The disease could be detected with unprecedented precision, yet it still could not be stopped. No therapy has proved effective. Trials of antimalarial and antibiotic compounds such as quinacrine and doxycycline failed to slow progression. Experimental antibodies that stabilize normal prion proteins showed promise in cell cultures and mice, but have not succeeded in humans. Because prion diseases advance rapidly and affect few individuals, pharmaceutical development remains limited. The only available care is palliative, managing anxiety, maintaining nutrition, and offering emotional support during the months when sleep disappears. Nevertheless, FFI has reshaped neurology. Its study confirmed that prion mechanisms underlie a spectrum of human neurodegenerative diseases. Concepts first defined in the sleepless family, protein misfolding, templated conversion, and molecular self-propagation, now inform research into Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. What began as an isolated family tragedy became the foundation for understanding disorders that affect millions. In 2018, a review in Nature Reviews Neurology summarized the field succinctly. Fatal familial insomnia remains incurable, but its lessons extend far beyond its incidence. It demonstrates the essential role of the thalamus in sleep and consciousness, and the vulnerability of protein homeostasis in the human brain. Today, laboratories use transgenic mice and cultured neurons to test molecules that might prevent prion propagation. Some researchers are exploring gene editing techniques to silence the mutant PRNP allele before it expresses the harmful protein. These approaches are theoretical and face significant ethical and safety hurdles, but they represent the first glimmers of intervention. For the original Italian lineage, privacy endures. A few descendants remain in contact with clinicians, undergoing periodic checkups, and contributing anonymized data. Others have chosen to live entirely outside the medical spotlight. Their wish is simple: to be remembered not as symbols of despair, but as the family whose involuntary sacrifice taught the world why sleep is sacred. In Bologna, the building that once housed Lugaresi's laboratory still stands. The equipment has changed, the purpose has not. Students now learn that sleep is not the absence of activity, but one of biology's most complex orchestras, a concert of electrical rhythms, chemical tides, and cellular repair. Without it, memory falters, immunity collapses, and the self dissolves. FFI revealed this truth in its starkest form. More than 60 years have passed since the first recorded case. The disease remains a reminder that science often advances through suffering, and that knowledge carries its own weight of sorrow. Yet within that sorrow lies meaning. Because one family allowed their story to be studied, countless others have been spared the same uncertainty in different forms of illness. The final word, perhaps, belongs to a simple fact. Every healthy person who lies down tonight and drifts into sleep is performing a miracle that the victims of fatal familial insomnia could no longer reach. Their legacy is the understanding that sleep is not a luxury or a mystery to be solved. It is the quiet proof of life itself.